Thank you all for coming. My name is Greil Marcus, and it's my pleasure to host the Riggio Forums during the semester. First guest we had was Stanley Crouch last month, and it's just an extreme pleasure for me to be able to invite and introduce Hilton Als tonight. Hilton might be best known as a theater critic for The New Yorker. As a critic, his range is far, far wider than that, going into film and music, into visual art, and into bringing all those things together in any number of ways and places. He has a great ear for all the complexities, variations, and comings together of American speech. When The New Yorker started, I don't know if it was in its first issue, in its prospectus, it said, as part of what it would do and what it was for, judgment will be passed on new books, theater, film. And one of the things that I so love about Hilton Als' writing is that it is not a matter of judgment. It is not a matter of celebration or dismissal. Putting one thing over here that you never need to think about again, and something over here that you'll be an impoverished person if you don't think about right now. Hilton's writing, to me, is about engagement. It's about a conversation that begins usually at the start of a piece, could be in the middle of a piece, where he is in conversation with the work that he's looking at or thinking about. And he's in conversation with you, the reader, with the people who might have been in the audience with him on any given night. And so you're brought into an event that seems to be taking place as it happens. To me, that is a rare and extraordinary thing to be able to do and to want to do, because so many people, it would never even occur to them. I'm just as full of anticipation for what Hilton is going to be talking about tonight as I'm sure. As you are?
As he is. Yeah.
All right, never mind.
No.
Just turn off your cell phones and hope for the best.
Yeah. Every man for himself.
Exactly. So I'm looking forward to what you're going to be talking about tonight.
Greil, thank you so much for inviting me, and Robert Polito and Luis and all the lovely people at the New School. And I have to sort of start a little bit off track today, and I can't look up because one of my favorite performers in the world is here, Kathleen Widows, and she, I learned really, I think, as much from reading as I do from watching people perform. And one of the thing that I'll be reading tonight is about Richard Pryor, and I'll be talking about how that piece is developed into a piece of fiction. But in any case, one of the hallmarks of a great performer is the ability to wait and to listen to what someone says and not be pressured by cameramen or the audience into reacting before there's a time to react. And so just the other day, the first film version of Chekhov's The Seagull was on, and Kathleen Widows was in the film. And I was so excited, and I sat down, and she plays Masha, and if you know the play, the man who's in love with her says, the first lines are, why do you always wear black? And she says, because I'm in mourning for my life. Well, I was wondering how Kathleen Widows would do that line, and so they're sort of fooling around in the leaves and so on, bucolic splendor, and he says, oh, Masha, why do you always wear black? And I mean, she sort of blanks him out in this really sort of deep way, like, actually have no interest in you as a lover or a person. And she says, because I'm in mourning for my life, and she starts putting her hair up as if death was on the same level as her coiffure. It's a great moment, and it's from moments like that that I really learn as a writer that waiting to publish something or waiting for the right word is essential to reaching out and touching someone with those moments and spaces and silence. So, and the person who sort of led me to these ideas about that performance stuff was a great actress named Kim Stanley, and I was trying to write a piece about her for the New Yorker, and she'd done very few films, and I would just call her at night. I had gotten her number. She lived in New Mexico, and she would ask me questions. She would say, "Do you read Chekhov?" And I'd say, "No, it's boring," or whatever I would say when I was years old. And she's like, "You have to read him. It's life." And I didn't know what that meant until I saw it performed, and I understood that the tedium the tedium and the joy was a mixture that couldn't really be extricated. So the stuff that I'm going to talk to you tonight is about things that can't be extricated, like the truth and fiction and so on. So I'll stand over there to do it, because if I sit here, I'll see you too clearly. Thank you, Greil. Again, I want to thank you very much for having me. We're gathered this evening to watch and hopefully listen to me do something rather dangerous, which is to say, talk about writing. It's an activity that doesn't bear scrutiny well because it's not much of an activity. In fact, it's marked by a great deal of inactivity. The novelist and journalist Renata Adler once remarked that the phrase "writers write" was one of the great falsehoods. Writers telephone, they procrastinate, they drink, but they rarely write, she said. And yet the work gets done. I don't know how we writers do it, given the obstacles we generally throw in our own way, like writer's block or hangovers or love affairs that don't work out. Not to mention the problems that we face, problems that are generated by writing itself, such as the eternal problem of what we say and how we mean to say it. Working on a piece of fact or fiction doesn't necessarily solve these problems, which is something I want to share with you tonight, an admixture of fact and fiction, and what that means in terms of what we can say, and what we can't say, and how we end up saying the unspeakable. I've always worked in the nonfiction form, but I've always loved stretching it to the limit, meaning it's my belief that nonfiction can have the emotional truth that fiction generally demands. While we demand or expect a certain aura of truth in fiction, though, it's not limited by the facts. In recent years, I felt constrained by the facts. This doesn't mean that I was prepared to write fiction. In fact, I was frightened of it, having worked in other genres almost exclusively, but stories dictate their own forms. Let's go back. In 1999, when I wrote about the comedian Richard Pryor, I felt my resistance to fiction melting away because Richard Pryor demanded an imaginative response to his life, his material. When I asked David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, whether or not I could write about Pryor, who was still alive at the time, I told him that I wanted to set myself the task of writing a profile about someone who couldn't be profiled, not in any traditional way. Richard Pryor, who was alive then, had MS and could barely speak. I wanted to invent him out of quotes and ephemera and hearsay. That is, I wanted to write fiction using a real character. I began the piece in this way. A Pryor Love, Skin Flick. Winter, 1973, late afternoon, the entr'acte between dusk and darkness, when the people who conduct their business in the street, numbers runners in gray Chesterfields, out-of-work barmaids playing the dozens, adolescents cultivating their cigarette jones and lust, small-time hustlers selling authentic gold wristwatches that are platinum bright, look for a place to roost and to drink in the day's sin. Young black guy, looks like the comedian Richard Pryor, walks into one of his hangouts, Opal's Silver Spoon Cafe. A greasy dive with an R&B jukebox. It could be in Detroit or in New York, could be anywhere. Opal's has a proprietor, Opal, a young and wise black woman who looks like the comedian Lily Tomlin, and a little bell over the door that goes tink-a-link, announcing all the handouts and gimmies who come to sit at Opal's counter and talk about how needy their respective asses are. Black guy sits at the counter and Opal offers him some potato soup, something nourishing, she says. Black guy has moist, on the verge of lying or crying eyes and a raggedy afro. He wears a green fatigue jacket, the kind of jacket brothers brought home from Nam, which guys like this guy continue to wear long after they've returned home, too shell-shocked or stoned to care much about their haberdashery. Juke, that's the black guy's name, is Opal's baby, flopping about in all of them narcotics he's trying to get off of by taking that methadone, which Juke and Opal pronounce methadone, the way two old-timey Southerners would, the way Juke and Opal's elders might have if they knew what that shit was or was for. Juke and Opal express their feelings for each other, their shared view of the world, in a lyrical language, a colored people's language, which tries to atomize their anger and their depression. Sometimes their anger is wry. Opal is tired of hearing about Juke's efforts to get a job and tells him so. Hand me that job about job training, she says. You trained all right. You highly skilled at not working. But that's not entirely true. Juke has submitted himself to the rigors of quote-unquote rehabilitation. I was down there for about 3 weeks at that place working, Juke says. Had on a suit, tie, shaving, acting crazy. Looked like a fool in a circus. Pause. And I'm fed up with it. Pause. Now I know how to do a job that don't know how to be done no more. Opal's face fills with sadness. Looking at her face can fill your mind with sadness. She says, for real? It's a rhetorical question that black people have always asked each other or themselves when they're handed more hopelessness. Is this for real? Night is beginning to spread all over Juke and Opal Street. It is the color of 1,000 secrets combined. The bell rings, and a delivery man comes in carting pies. The doorbell's tiny peal. 2 white people, a man and a woman, social workers, enter Opal's, youngish, trench-coated. And the minute the white people enter, something terrible happens from an aesthetic point of view. They alienate everything. They fracture our suspended disbelief. They interrupt our identification with the protagonists of the TV show. I'm sorry. Hold on. I love when you turn off your cell phone. Oh. Hi, I'm giving a reading right now. Can I call you back? Okay. Sorry. We were at the white people, right? Okay. They interrupt our identification with the protagonist of the TV show we've been watching, which becomes TV only when those social workers start hassling our Juke, our Opal, equal halves of the same resilient black body. When we see those white people, we start thinking about things like credits, and remember that this is a television play, after all, written by the brilliant Jane Wagner, and played with astonishing alacrity and compassion by Richard Pryor and Lily Tomlin on Lily, Tomlin's second variety special, which aired on CBS in 1973, and which remains, a little over a quarter of a century later, the most profound meditation on race and class that I have ever seen on a major network. We're doing some community research and we'd like to ask you a few questions, the white woman social worker declares as soon as she enters Opal's. Juke and Opal are more than familiar with this line of inquiry, which presumes that people like them are always available for questioning, servants of the liberal cause. I wonder if you can tell me, have you ever been addicted to drugs? The woman asked Juke. Pryor as Juke responds instantly. Yeah, I've been addicted, he says. I'm addicted right now. Don't write it down, man. Be cool. It's not for the public. I mean, what I go through is private. He's incapable of making fuck you his first response, or even his first thought. Being black has taught him how to allow white people their innocence. For black people, being around white people is sometimes like taking care of babies you don't like. Babies who throw up on you again and again, but whom you can't punish because they're babies. Eventually, you direct that anger at yourself. It has nowhere else to go. Juke tries to turn the questioning around a little through humor, which is part of his pathos. I have some questions, he tells the community researchers, then tries to approximate their straight white tone. Who's Pigmeat Markham's mama? He asks. Wilt Chamberlain, the tallest colored chap you ever saw? When the white people have left and Juke is about to leave, wrapped in his thin jacket, he turns to Opal and says, You sweet, you a sweet woman, I'll think about you. His eyes are wide with love and need, and maybe fear or madness. Be glad when it's spring, he says to Opal. Pause. Flower. By the time the article came out, I felt strange and unsettled. I had started to write fiction, but I didn't want to leave facts behind. And as much as I loved writers like E.L. Doctorow and Gertrude Stein and Milan Kundera, writers who used real characters in fiction, I was looking for something more internal to talk about the ways in which celebrity and blackness and maleness could and had been internalized by me and perhaps had shaped my father, for instance. But I didn't want to write a memoir. Slowly, blindly, I began to write a book called Richard Pryor, a novel, that would concern itself with the issues I've raised here a bit. But the book, as you're about to hear it, didn't exist for many years. For many years, I told other stories in the book, stories that had nothing to do with Richard Pryor or blackness or maleness, issues I had in no way dealt with before on such a large scale. And perhaps that's what I mean to talk about through reading this work, how writing surprises us if we mean to do the work of writers, which is to ignore genre and to listen to the stories that define us and come from somewhere in us, but outside of us as well. It took me many years, but the novel I mean to write and meant to write turned out to be a book about my father who died a number of years ago, a man whose intelligence and fear I saw in Richard Pryor's performances. So I used a real person, my father, to talk about a real person, Richard Pryor, but only as each affected and formed my life as a writer, which is to say, my imagination. Here are the book's beginnings, and perhaps we can talk about it later or after you've read the book itself. The book begins with the piece that you just heard me read a little bit of, and then you turn it to part two, and part two begins this way. As it happens, Richard Pryor and the reporter met only once, on the page, when, in the spring of 1998, the reporter began collecting information about the comedian for his article, which ran in a national magazine the following winter, by conducting various interviews, listening to Pryor's old routines on audio tape or CD, scanning a number of critical studies and biographies for details about the star's personal life, business dealings, and so on. It gradually became clear to him that his finished report, if his finished report was to reflect anything of the numerous turns Richard Pryor's mind had taken over the course of his life and career, the reporter's writing would have to be as nonlinear as one of Pryor's better monologues, a joke with no end, with a number of punchlines and not a little political content. But that piece was not to be. The reporter was lousy with responsibility. He reasoned that since he had pitched one assignment, to write a credible portrait of the by then almost entirely silent, reclusive artist, he could not hand in something else. And yet, as the reporter gathered more and more facts about Richard Pryor, they seemed to add up to less and less on the page. For, after many years of reporting what this or that maker of modern culture, such as it was, had done and how they had done it, the reporter felt he could no longer do this, arrange quotes in a manner meant to satisfy a magazine or newspaper's idea of the truth, which he had always considered specious anyway. Nor did the reporter feel he could continue doing this, interviewing makers of modern culture, such as they were, as if he cared, or that they made a difference to his way of thinking. At one point, the reporter had cared. Years passed, and then he did not. In between, the reporter lost sight of the kind of writing he wanted to accomplish when he first started out, fact that had the penumbra of fiction. But there was no home for that kind of writing once the reporter started publishing in the early 1990s. Even the quote-unquote alternative newspapers and magazines he wrote for then wanted fact upon fact, as if no one believed the world they lived in. Several years before meeting Richard Pryor on the page, the reporter had tried, as an alternative to journalism, to write a novel. But he found the form as limiting as fact. There was no truth in it. It had always been that way. When the reporter read fiction, he wanted the novel under review to include the truth of the world. And when he read fact, he wished the writer had imbued it with something of the truth of their imagination. What the reporter did not know how to do, create an admixture of fact and fiction in an extended work that defied both genres. Then he began to think about Richard Pryor, who, in his work at least, had done nothing but. The reporter knew of no greater modern practitioner or melder of journalistic ethos and the morality inherent in fiction than Richard Pryor. The comedian's work and life were rife with such issues. "Tell me the truth so I can look at these lies," one made-up Richard Pryor character said to another through the real Richard Pryor once. In monologue after monologue and using a variety of different-sounding voices, Richard Pryor portrayed characters that represented the truth of the world or the truth of the world as his characters saw it. He was everything: a junkie talking to a straight black man who would not help him, a white woman talking to her black lover, his heart talking to himself, his own daddy talking to a younger and no less sad and horny Richard Pryor, a German shepherd. He had also played a monkey, the monkey's dick, and a white movie executive. Once, he was even the entire continent of Africa. Maybe he could play a reporter. Pryor appealed to the reporter as a subject for another equally salient reason: his silence. By the spring of 1998, when the reporter started to research and write his piece, eventually called A Pryor Love, Richard Pryor's speech had been severely limited by MS. He could not be interviewed. If anyone wanted to write about him, they would have to make him up to some extent. At first, the reporter reveled in Richard Pryor's silence. He loved the thought of not having to interview the artist and then check transcripts of what Richard Pryor actually said against what Richard Pryor might have intended. But the reporter would have to fill Richard Pryor's silence with something. What that something was, he did not know. After the initial rush of imagining what Richard Pryor might say, the reporter froze. He was not free enough in his mind to record it. Journalism had rendered his perceptibility speechless. So he reverted back to the facts about what Richard Pryor ate and when, the number of women he slapped or married, and so on. As the reporter set about trying to build a narrative based on the facts available to him, Richard Pryor set about trying to destroy them. He demanded the reporter look beyond his already heavily documented life and incorporate something of his own imagination in the piece. Fair was fair. Hadn't he, Richard Pryor, made a spectacle of himself in order to reveal certain truths about himself in the world? The very idea frightened the reporter, which is why Richard Pryor made the suggestion in the first place, to shock and inspire him. After all, Richard Pryor's best work had grown out of, or was an expression of, fright over the way women behaved, over the way white people behaved, and how cocaine made him behave. Now he wanted to be afraid of the reporter, or rather surprised. Having lived in the reporter's mind since the spring of 1998, they shared a room in Lower Manhattan. Not much was in it except old magazines, a computer, and a telephone. For years and years after they met, Richard Pryor and the reporter lived with no one else. So the comedian knew just how nasty his imagination was. Richard Pryor wondered why the reporter didn't exploit his imagination along with the facts in order to say something new, or at any rate, hitherto unsaid about Richard Pryor. Maybe the reporter could write about what a sensitive louse Richard Pryor was, or how lousy America was with Richard Pryors, guys who, failing to find a mic, found the needle. To that end, Richard Pryor, or at least the one who lived in the reporter's mind, suggested this: that the reporter simply use his name, Richard Pryor, and make the rest of him up. Would that free the reporter to say what Richard Pryor knew he wanted to say? that colored men like Richard Pryor, like the reporter, were political by birth, that for them, reading newspapers, let alone writing for them, was a strange enterprise since they were so often that very news's targets. The truth is, Richard Pryor would not settle for being defined by facts alone. To do so would be to negate the spirit behind his entire body of work, wherein an existentially freaked guy named Richard Pryor always told lies to get at the truth. This would not do. The reporter had been commissioned to write facts. He could not add his imagination to all that. He had been trained, or as one editor had it, professionalized, not as a writer, but as a journalist. So, over the years, he had grown to distrust his imagination. Not so much distrust it as to defend himself against it by discounting his imagination's market value, which is where journalism leads you, counting words against dollars. And besides, the reporter said, reasoning with the Richard Pryor in his mind, who would pay him to describe where Richard Pryor persisted in taking his writing, even after Pryor Love had been filed and published, from fact to fiction with a little of each in both. The fact is, Richard Pryor thought a Pryor Love was some kind of joke. He saw the published article from his perch in the reporter's mind when it first came out, and once he focused on it, he liked to die. First of all, he couldn't get over all those neat columns of type filled with facts. He couldn't get his head around how all those little columns, pillars of truth, were meant to resemble the reporter's mind, which was not neat. In fact, Richard Pryor knew, having lived with a reporter as long as he lived with anyone, especially women, that his charge distrusted direct statements of any kind. They contradicted the way his mind worked. Nevertheless, Richard Pryor could not get his own head around the way a Pryor Love didn't work. It seemed the reporter had boiled his life and work down to a single idea or notion. Only America could have produced a Richard Pryor, the freak. The fact is, it took the reporter some time to convince Richard Pryor that he did not have a say in how a Pryor Love was laid out. Journalists rarely had that kind of power. And why not, Richard Pryor wondered aloud. Being colored, Richard Pryor believed in the look of things, that the inside of something was equal to its exterior. For him, each had its own aesthetic and thus moral weight. As a performer, Richard Pryor had illustrated his words by using his body. What better way to show your words value than by putting your body graphics out there with it too? The reporter tried to explain, his tone was defensive now, how different his role in the culture was. He said that, as a journalist, he was meant to be omnipresent, a faithful recorder of the deeds and actions of others, a messenger dispatching the truth of the world, a conduit to the facts, a paragon of honesty, a gatherer of quotes, a reaper of truth, a non-historicizer, a defender of accuracy, an enemy of fiction, resistant to interpretation, blind to subtlety, dead to the subject's various sensitivities once they supplied the killing quote. The look of things was of little interest to him. Richard Pryor did not buy any of this. Still, even though one version of Richard Pryor had run, the subject retained the hope that the reporter would go on to write others. It was not too late, or was it? For what Richard Pryor saw lurking behind the reporter's rhetoric about the journalist's role was a writer who was afraid to be an author and say I, as Richard Pryor had or did. What Richard Pryor gleaned from all the lies the reporter insisted on telling even now. Writing the truth for a living, if he ever did, hadn't gotten the reporter any closer to speaking it. The reporter wouldn't hear any of this. What did Richard Pryor know in the end, especially when it came to other people? Hadn't he been a boozer and a junkie, so self-absorbed he'd made a number of wives tremble with neglect? Is that what he wanted to reduce the reporter to, a trembling woman who'd lost her reason, all foolish and in love, waiting for Richard Pryor to inspire him to write the truth about the world, his world, as he saw it? The reporter knew who he was. Richard Pryor didn't. Wasn't that one reason Richard Pryor had to play all those different characters, because he didn't know who he was? Richard Pryor loved all of that. Had the reporter put any of his questions, ambivalences, or rage vis-a-vis his subject into a Pryor love, then it would have made the piece worth reading, at least insofar as one reader was concerned. But the reporter had not. Richard Pryor could not forgive him for all those neat columns of type, magazine policy, was magazine policy, but what he could not get over was how the reporter had reduced the Richard Pryor in his mind to a single idea or notion. How could he let that happen? The reporter defended himself against Richard Pryor's scorn by describing certain rules of journalism that were, again, outside his control. Richard Pryor scoffed. In his whole life, the comedian had never known one colored gentleman who had the luxury of having a single thought at any given time. In order to survive America, let alone have a career, you had to be many things to many people, all in an effort to dodge your generally white interlocutor's subconscious desire for you not to use your mind or speak their language. Richard Pryor went on. If the reporter couldn't express on the page what it looked like when one existentially freaked guy named Richard Pryor met an equally freaked guy like the reporter, what was the point of writing? Where was the story, not to mention the truth? The reporter was not willing to concede all that. 2 years and then 6 years after Pryor Love came out, he still wouldn't. To do so would mean admitting to several truths he admitted from the piece in order to make it less about himself than journalism, which is to say more about the facts than the real story, which was how this existentially freaked colored guy was continually drawn to and repelled by the romance he found in the other. Like it or not, Richard Pryor's vexing "who's your daddy" tone during the preceding conversations instigated the reporter's ever-present just below the surface "what's a daddy" belligerence, a nasty bowl filled with rhetoric and certain facts. The truth is, the reporter probably wouldn't have been ready for Richard Pryor had he not made room for the comedian by severing ties with his own father first. He could not have two fathers, black fathers, having had too much and too little of his own to begin with. The reporter had stopped speaking to his father in 1993. The reporter was 32 years old then. The reason for their break? Well, it would take a Richard Pryor to describe it. Suffice to say that once the reporter realized he had spent the majority of his writing life turning out the facts his father revered in a world his son grew to distrust, the world of journalism with its fake impartiality, access reporting, and the rest, and practically no time whatever he meant to writing what he meant to write, the reporter stopped treating his dad with the same reverence as Richard Pryor's potentially cocksucking junkie behaved towards the older, clueless, self-obsessed wino he meets on the street one Sunday afternoon in his 1977 routine, Wino and Junkie, with hope, as though there was a father to be had underneath all that unfortunate dick. And now here was Richard Pryor calling it all that daddy shit up again, if only because his goading and all his unanswerable questions were so much like the father's. Were Richard Pryor and the father the same in the end? Were all black men, the Pudd'nhead Wilson idea, some version of one another? For a long time, the reporter believed he owed his father language, that the father's interest in language was generated by a form, journalism, that held little if any interest to his son from the beginning didn't matter. The reporter took owing wherever he could take it. For the reporter then, every act of writing was this: I shall always be his son, whoever he is. Even after he had met Richard Pryor, who, one suspects, only read newspapers when he was in them, the reporter was writing to commemorate his first language, his father's. Not speaking to his father all those years before he met Richard Pryor on the page did not minimize what he felt he owed him. The silence only served to increase it, but no one can bear silence on its own. Most of us fill it with memories, which is the language of silence. The fact is, the reporter loved his father's interest in the news. At first, the reporter didn't know that the words the fathers read with such relish were facts. To him, they were just words. How could some words be true and others false? By the time the reporter got around to trying to make the distinction between fact and fiction, he couldn't determine which words belonged where, so he split the difference. He didn't mean to. At 10, at 20, even after he became a reporter, the reporter tried to like facts, if only to please his father. When the reporter was 10 and started reading novels, it was borne in on him that the news was just that. Having a news hound for a dad allowed the reporter to imagine he had a father who was a powerful citizen in the world. He knew so much about it. And if he knew so much about it, couldn't he protect his only son's black ass, as Richard Pryor might put it, from various hurts and truths, using the facts he liked and knew as a weapon? Actually, this was a difficult illusion or hope for the reporter to maintain. Richard Pryor's jokes only confirmed what the reporter knew at 10, at 20, even after he became a reporter. It was foolish to believe that a colored man could save a colored boy from anything when they couldn't even save themselves. Look at Richard Pryor. Look at the reporter's father. Still, the reporter struggled to maintain the illusion that the father was a father and thus protector. He had no other. So in the reporter's child's mind, which is to say in his imagination, the father was a force of right, a bulwark against the world's various injustices, the living embodiment of many pages from Hegel's philosophy of right, particularly when it came to the philosopher's views on men and their possessing a quote-unquote universal sense of right and wrong, which they attained only through stress of thought and much specialized effort. Women, on the other hand, Hegel said, were influenced by accidental inclinations and opinions. Women were like plants, with their, quote, unfolding of nature, a process whose principle is the less clearly determined unity of feeling, unquote. The reporter had to believe in this differentiation of mind in order to imagine that the father was a man, not a flower. And not just any man, but a universal man, an owner of facts, and as such, a moralist, since he knew what was right and wrong with the world, having read all about it. If the father was such a man, then his son, by extension, lived in the right too. Was he not born of the father's unimpeachable, distinctly male veracity? This had to be so. It made the reporter's imagination right. It made his unfolding nature right. And it made the father's fractured unity of feeling all right too. In truth, the reporter's father was not in the world. He was in his room. He lived on the top floor of an apartment building that his mother owned. Sometimes in the morning, the reporter would wake up there and watch his father shave, his tiny tits jiggling in his sleeveless white t-shirt as he did so. Instinctually, the reporter would look away from his father's moving tits, just as the father often looked away from his only son. Then the reporter would look at the ship on the old bottle of Old Spice, a pirate world. Looking at breasts and feeling tenderness toward them, let alone wanting to touch them, was a form of piracy. After the father finished shaving, he'd rub Old Spice all over the lower half of his face. Then, without looking down at his son, he'd dab a bit of Old Spice behind each of the reporter's ears. The reporter tried not to shiver, but he did anyway. Eros was a finger. Thank you. I'm sorry I had to keep adjusting my glasses, but I forgot my Whitney Houston handkerchief and to blot my face while I was perspiring, but it's all over now. Thank you so much for listening, and I wanted to be fair to you and take questions and or disparagements of any sort are always welcome. What did you find interesting or not interesting? And does anyone remember who Richard Pryor is? He was a great, I realized suddenly that so many of you guys were so young that you might not have known that he had this sort of huge significance in the world for a long time, and it was largely because he actually discovered his voice running away from success. The first round of success had happened when he was in Las Vegas, and he realized that he was doing Bill Cosby's routines, and this was in the late 60s, and he walked out of the casino taking his tuxedo off and jumped up on a sort of baccarat table with his underwear on and started yelling. And he had clearly lost his mind, and it was a necessary thing for him to do. He then sort of escaped to Northern California, to Oakland, and holed up in an apartment for many, many weeks and just sort of walked around and listened to the people and remembered his life. And one of the aspects of his life was that he had grown up in a whorehouse in Peoria, Illinois, run by his grandmother. And the black life that he saw in Oakland at that time, so it's the very late 60s, early 70s, was deeply significant to him in terms of remembering the language of his youth. It's very similar to when James Baldwin, you guys know who he is, right? Um, New to Europe, and all he took with him were some Bessie Smith records that really helped him recall the language of his youth. So there's, I was really interested in how to go back to find the language of truth and fiction, which there was a huge split in my household about it. My parents didn't live together, but they were big readers, and my mother was a big, it says everything. I'm going to tell you her favorite novel was Crime and Punishment, and that tells you all you need to know about her. And she was a great woman, and I really loved her a lot. And there's a man here who knows her from her block in Brooklyn. Anyway, my father was I didn't know this until many years after he died, but one of my sisters told me that he had studied for many years to be a court reporter. And it was the most astonishing thing to know that your DNA, without knowing the stories of your parents, that your DNA replicates itself sometimes, even in rebelling against what they were doing. So I wanted to really talk about what that split felt like, and also the differences of mind. Richard Pryor is just someone who is so great that you don't really have to do that much work. You can just imagine what he would say, and he just doesn't stop talking. Initially, the book included scenes with James Baldwin, but they didn't like that at all. They didn't like sharing. And I asked Baldwin if he would mind waiting, and he said no. So it's Richard. Richard won because he's just meaner. And that's really the genesis of it. And the book is not finished yet because I've written many versions of it. And I think I finally have it. So it'll be finished sometime, I think, in the spring. But you can ask me anything about work that you've read. Oh, hi, Anna. Hi.
How would you define a novel?
Oh, this young man has a microphone. Do you want to repeat it so they can hear you?
What is your definition of the novel?
Oh, I think it's such a great genre to work in because you can do anything. And if you just use that word, people look at it differently. I think one of our friends, Lisa Cohen, has written this great book in which she talks about a great writer who wrote novels, so-called, but were really sort of the stories of her life. I think that there's such a wide range. It can be people like Renata Adler that use journalism and story. It can be Jamaica Kincaid writing about the past. I think that nonfiction is much more limited because you can't make up the exchange. You can't make up the feeling. The feeling or the exchange has to be generated by what actually took place. So I like reading novels generally that you wouldn't even classify as novels. I feel much freer in that space. One book I would recommend is Elizabeth Hardwick's Sleepless Nights. Another book I would recommend completely is, a memoir that I would recommend, Boris Pasternak's Safe Passage. Safe Context, thank you. Another book I would wholeheartedly recommend is anything really early Peter Handke. He covers that very well about his family and Germany. And Kundera is great too. Hi, there's a guy back there.
Hi. Did you find it difficult to divorce yourself from nonfiction to go toward writing fiction?
I think that what happens is that you have to kind of have two jobs, and you have to, so that the fiction or the nonfiction doesn't ever feel synthetic to you at any given time. I think it's important to split the day between the two. So I'm one of those people who often feels like a fraud about everything that it's just been totally dishonest, and I have to go and apologize to all the people of the world. And and I think one way to sort of to keep your head clear of that is to really sort of work in both forms, so you feel that you're talking to all the people all the time. I'm not aware of audience so much as I'm aware of different voices. That sounds very Three Faces of Eve, but it's sort of, it's more, I write fictional things in the morning because I think that when we're sleeping, our subconscious really helps us. And I can do stuff for the magazine in the late morning, afternoon, because it feels like that's my job, that's work. But what's great about that is that the language that informs that is the fictional language you've had access to for several hours before. So then it's just a mess, but I don't feel torn between those two things anymore. I just actually had to go to bed earlier, and that really helps. Because the sleep really helps the subconscious, and you have to rest. Hi Tom.
Hey, Hilton, how are you? People have been asking about genre, and I'm interested more in in the question of style. And in particular in what you've just been reading, this incantation of the word reporter.
Yes.
It's interesting that you reveal your father was a court reporter, because there was almost
he had
studied to be, yes. But
That's
there was
even more profound.
right. Yes. But so I'm curious
It made me
about
love him,
that
actually.
idea of repetition, and at least in the passage you read, not a lot of description of the character of reporter,
Right.
but this insistence of
This sort of almost platonic dialogue.
right. So I was curious, how is that something you arrived at, or it
Yes,
pushed itself?
after
or what
many,
happened?
many, many years and many, 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 many pages that were the most beautifully written pages in the world, were totally useless because we didn't know who he was. And there was no way to describe. The great thing is that Richard Pryor is so famous to some people over 40 that that you don't have to describe him physically. And the reporter doesn't really exist without any of the other voices. So you'll have the scene with the father, which is followed by this long description of the mother. And so he actually is a reporter. We all are, because if we're writing, we're looking. And in a way, writing is the most unfair occupation because everyone has a copyright on their own lives. It's just that they gave birth to a writer, and that's the worst. But I really do love them. And I've learned to imagine them much more freely, having come to love them. And every parent does the best they can. Yeah. So the style of it really is them, I feel. Hi.
Hello, Hilton. Thanks for the reading.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask you, who is telling the story?
The reporter.
The reporter is actually,
He's telling the story, but Richard Pryor keeps jumping in.
is that what you mean by platonic dialogue?
Yeah, that he keeps saying, when I jump, they're very short paragraphs, and when I say things like Richard Pryor laughed or he thought otherwise, and then he starts talking. So it's that kind of dialogue. And then in the little bit of section that I read just now about the father, that's much more in the third person. It's about the parents and being informed by language. Because they had different relationship to it. My mother's relationship to books, I think, was an escape from the hard jobs that she had, and my father didn't enter the world in that way. So he brought the world into his room, where she went out into the world, and she was there. So I always say that, not that you didn't want to hear this, but my sexuality is really funny because my mother was like the dude. She didn't talk really. she was a capable person out in the world. So everything is flipped in terms of my gender stuff. But you don't need to know that, but it's interesting for the people who want to share my little room sometimes, however that works out. Yeah. I think sex helps too. You can work things out sexually. Speaking of the subconscious. Hi.
Hi, I'm Hilton. So
Hey.
first, I'd like to say thanks.
Thank you.
And thanks not just for reading, but for your writing. I'm one of those people, I read you in the New Yorker. Actually, no, I'll never see one of those plays that you've written about,
Yes.
but I just read it for the writing. So
Oh, thank you
thanks.
so much.
Okay, so I have a million questions, but I'll just throw out maybe two things. One, Cat Williams.
Okay.
Maybe if you care to talk about what you think about him in relation to Richard Pryor. But you know, and you don't have to say, you don't have to deal with that at all. So this one, maybe.
That's an interesting,
Yeah,
complicated.
but the one that
Can you explain to the audience?
Right, because I'm one of those people over 40, so I know who Richard Pryor is, and Cat Williams strikes me as very similar to Richard Pryor in what I
Yeah.
think of their crazy, ironic genius. But you don't have to deal with Cat
Okay.
Williams.
Okay.
The thing that I wonder to what extent this is about you having that perverse desire that maybe we all over 40 have, which is to have Richard Pryor perform for us.
Yes. Oh, you're completely correct, and you're anticipating what happens later in the book. Is that he becomes very much involved with the narrator's mother, and so that's a nice little Oedipal thing that happens there. You wouldn't be surprised because you've met me, so where else would it go but a sort of Oedipal situation? But she's my mother in real life. I would have friends who were much, much older than me, often, and male, and they were very interested in me, and they would take me to see dance things and concerts and so on. And one day, and I ended up sleeping with one of these people, and one day I went to his house, and my mother was there. And she was beautifully dressed. And I remember it was like a sort of pink dress that she had made and a hat. And they had struck up a relationship on the telephone that I didn't know anything about. And she was just curious. And my parents were really deeply eccentric people. And so, you know, we all went out to dinner or whatever we did. But I just wanted to really write about how we get parented. I think it's really what I mean, is that how do we get parented? And how interesting they are to me. How interesting, I'm almost always interested. I've been accused of this, of meeting parents or friends and just having no interest in the friend after I've met the parents, because the parent often has so much more history. And they don't tell children the half of what they have to do to survive and raise them. So it's just an interesting story to me. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
One of my favorite pieces by you is in the Glenn Ligon Whitney Museum of American Art's retrospective catalog. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit about your process for writing about art or your relationship to writing about art.
Because I wrote it in Glenn's book?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, in the America book?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay. When I was, I had started off as an actor at performing arts. I went to performing arts, but I didn't like being in front of people. I liked working out the script, and I liked improvising, because that was like writing. So when I was going to college, I graduated very early, and then I had some strange experiences. I stopped, and then I went to Columbia. No, I went to the New School for a year, and I had a Professor Chang, and I loved Chinese art, and he came up to me. He said, "You would be a very good art historian." I didn't know what that was, so I read a profile of Henry Geltzoller. Do you guys remember him? He was the New York State Commission of the Arts, and he was a really great friend to artists. And I said, well, that's great, because you get to hang out with artists. And I'll be an art historian. So I went to Columbia and I studied art history, and with NYU-related Professor Kenneth Silver, who's at the Institute, who's amazing professor. And I wrote a paper, I think this is fine to say now, I wrote a paper on Warhol's Ethel Skull 36 Times, that beautiful painting, and Holly Solomon portraits. And Ken took me into his office. This is when Columbia was an all-boys school and you could smoke in class. That's how old we are. And he said, Mr. Als, this is a fantastic paper. People have always saved me. This is a fantastic paper, and I have something to ask you, and I could be fired for it, but I want to ask you, and I hope it's all right. And I said, oh, that's fine, Professor Silver. He said, are you a homosexual? And I said, yes, I am. He said, oh, thank God, and put his head down on the table. He said, now I'm going to say something else that's significant. You are a writer. Do not become an art historian because you will not like the rules of the academy. I can see that in your writing, and I can see it in your person and the friends that you make. And it was a much smaller school, that universe then. And so I stopped taking those courses, and whenever I write about art, whether it's Kara Walker and all these great people, it's almost always I feel that I want to explain them to other people. And if that means, I also don't like the language of art criticism very much, or art historical language, because it's borrowed French language that was bad 40 years ago. So I try to write descriptively and very clearly. And I think that's what Ken was really saying, was that it was so different than what I would have to do as a writer, that I should just write. So I really approach it as a writer who's looking. And it's such an amazing period. And I loved writing about art for a while, and then I stopped when, I think the late 80s, early 90s, when there was a lot of money around, and it really I found it really disturbing and upsetting. And it was really people like Kara Walker who got me interested again. Brent Sikkema, her dealers, fantastic. And my friend Peter Doig and I curated a show together in Berlin. And those people, as I tell you the Ken Silver story, I tell you those stories about my mother meeting a friend of mine, that people have always been so kind to me. Even in the sort of terrible moments, there's always someone who has hope. And when I was writing a profile of Jane Fonda, it was really kind of amazing, because this woman should not even know how to get out of bed, given her history. It's like insane. Am I wrong, Kathleen Widows? And she said that she was, when her mother killed herself when she was about 11 or something, and her father kept it from her. And I said, how did you find out as a young girl the things to do? She said, I would always go to the mothers or the older sisters of friends. And she said, and it was always the horizon line for me. Like, if I could talk to them, then there was a horizon to something. And that's how I feel about meeting artists like Kara and Peter, or being here, for instance. There's always a horizon. And that's what I hope, particularly in art critical work, because that's the hardest kind of writing to do, because it's not a dialogue. It's just the thing. And I just try to really have the conversation with it, and clearly. But always keep your eye on that horizon thing. It's amazing. People will just actually come up to you. I think it was a combination of, what would you say, Louise? What would it be a combination of? My sort of openness, I guess, right? Curiosity about people. And also the weirdness of my parents. I just kind of inherited it. And I'm grateful to them for that. They're remarkable people. Hi.
Hi, thank you, Hilton. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
reading. When you were reading earlier tonight, you were talking about the moment when the white folks walk into that bar and it sort of interrupts everything. And
In the film, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and and he's described the white folks as the babies that are always vomiting on everyone. And it
I always
reminded
need
me,
to leave that out, and then I just think it's unfair to Richard. I mean, Richard's feeling these things. Is that clear?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
And it reminded me of Baldwin, and some of the Baldwin that I've read is particularly in The Fire Next Time, when he's talking about this sort of infant mentality of Americans, particularly white folks, and he eventually gets to the idea of love and trying to accept oneself.
He's talking about innocence and how basically he couldn't afford the innocence that's almost that's commodified by white culture. So in the movies and some books and so on, he would always get irritated by those moments. But the brilliance of that book is that when he goes to the Nation of Islam, he finds a similar kind of like innocence that drives him crazy. So I think what he's talking about really, and then also when he's talking about the black church, and he has that great line about how it took everything in his power as a boy preacher not to scream at his congregation, get off your knees and let's organize a rent strike.
Right.
Like those moments where you are, I think Richard's self-destruction had to do with his being an amazing seer as well, and that there was no protection between it and him. And one of the things that he did was drugs. It's a very easy way to handle that situation. But I think that the harshness of those words is something that he felt all the time. And then he stopped using the N-word, which I was grateful for, in his career. And he said, it just makes me cry. It's so beautiful. He said, I'm just never using that word again. He said in front of the audience. He said, because it's about our own degradation. That's amazing. And he changed that around too. So the stuff that you're hearing from him predates his changing. And in the book, he changes from love. But how could he couldn't say that stuff anymore. He had biracial kids, and one of the great things about, for instance, interviewing Lily Tomlin for that piece was, you guys know Lily Tomlin, right? Okay. Well, one of the great things was that she brought her partner of many years, Jane Wagner, and they made me meet them in LA at this place called, what's the famous place in Cuba that Hemingway used to go to? Flores? Cafe Flores. It's a place in LA, and it's like this kind of rundown, great place. And when I walked in, I sat down and I started to cry because I realized she wanted me to feel comfortable, that it was like a mixed place for me to feel comfortable. And then they came in, and she used to have this amazing character called Purvis, and Purvis really was Teddy Pendergrass. So she was Teddy Pendergrass. Wig, dark makeup, blue suit. And she said, Hilton, oh, I loved Richard so much, I met him in a good time house. And I said, what? She says, he made me meet him once in a good time house, and he made me meet him once in a porno theater in LA to have meetings about him being on the show. And for one great performer to do that to another really is, it's like when Robert De Niro used to take Jodie Foster on the subway before they did Taxi Driver. And she said he wouldn't really talk. They would just go through the subway system. And it wasn't until they were doing the movie that she realized it was not just to make her feel comfortable, but for her to understand what New York looked like. So the greatness of Richard and Lily together in particular was breaking each other down. CBS said she could not kiss him at the end of the show. She was going to go and kiss all the guests. And if you look at that tape, it is astonishing. She says, I want to thank all my guests, and she goes and kisses them. And last but not least, Richard Pryor, and gives him the biggest kiss. And he falls off his chair, laughing. It's just great when when artists can really respect and collaborate on that level. But look her Purvis thing up. And she does it there's a tape of it at San Francisco State, and you can hear women screaming in the audience. And Purvis would sing very sort of like low Barry White R&B songs, but they would be about the ecology. So it'd be like the whale, I want to save the whales, baby, that kind of thing. But I learned an enormous amount, as I say, from performers in that way in terms of being free is essential, being free and relaxed. Yes, Kathleen, that would you say? Relaxation is hugely key. I've learned to be more relaxed in writing by doing it in the morning, before all that starts, that noise starts. I have a question for Kathleen Widows. Do you mind? Because she's the best actress. Did you study with Lee?
I've never studied acting. When I first started acting, there was so much acting available that I didn't have time to study acting. I mean, there were just tons of plays on Broadway, tons of plays off Broadway. I was too busy doing it. Wow. I still don't know how to do it, but I...
I think you've done fine. You can also rent...
I'm here studying. I'm a student here at the New School.
What are you studying
At the
here?
moment, I'm studying literature and writing. I'm in the Riggio program.
Fantastic.
I've gone back to school.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Guys, rent the group and watch her. Rent, what's the piece with Sam Waterston?
Much Ado About Nothing.
You can get it. You can get all these films. Really, just watch her and just be amazed and learn. Just take from it for whatever your discipline is, because it's about freedom and imagination and relaxation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.